After nearly 100 days of fighting, Furious is finally joined by another carrier. Ladies, gents, and everybody in between, welcome back to the Battle of the Atlantic. As you've just seen, the carrier HMS Formidable had just linked up with HMS Furious. However, the more astute may notice that it's day 99, October the 18th, whereas week 15 would have started on the 16th. Fear not though, you haven't missed much, and what you have missed can essentially be summed up as... In any case, the job hadn't quite been finished just yet. So Formidable now providing most of the task force's fleet air defense screen, the cruisers made their run in to continue bombardments. At this stage of the operation, Convoy Australia was providing logistics and supplies to the task force, while Resub 1 made their way to the islands from Gibraltar. After the cruisers rearmed, the task force went back in, only to bump into U-boats en route. Rather curiously, the U-boat spawned almost right underneath the task force, torpedoes passing by the cruiser Shropshire. Cossack and Furious ran circles around each other in an attempt to narrowly avoid a collision, while off in the distance, a second set of torpedoes ran past Shropshire. Given that I had been recording week 15 at 2 in the morning, the task force got the hell out of Dodge instead of me sticking the engagement to find the U-boats. And as you can see later on, it was showing that I was sleep deprived while playing. As it turned out, I had been bombarding the islands, despite the fact that the base there had already been completely destroyed. An embarrassment, but what of it? In any case, with the Azore stronghold having been thoroughly knocked out, Task Force Fury made for Gibraltar, while Convoy Australia and Resub 1 headed back to Liverpool. So, while the various groups make their transit, I would like to acknowledge and apologise to the writer of a comment on part 10 of this little series. Specifically, a comment made by user Patrick Wilkinson7351, because I completely agree with their assessment of the situation as of now, and their recommended course of action, and I can't actually put into action their recommendations. Boiled down to its basics, Patrick recommended to place Furious and the more heavily damaged ships in my various task forces in dry dock for repairs, while the Germans only have one operational heavy surface vessel, that being the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. They also suggested acquiring a handful of Dido-class anti-aircraft light cruisers to counter the German air threat, since they're the British equivalent of the Atlantic-class. Again, this assessment I totally agree with, and the single reason I can't action it is because I have a massive backlog of raw gameplay footage that I have recorded in batches that I'm working through. Hell, week 15 and week 16 were recorded on the 25th and 26th of June, and I'm only voicing this script on the 17th of August. So, Patrick, if you're watching this, I am so sorry for not being able to act on your suggestions, but I genuinely appreciate the thought that went into them. In any case, back to War on the Sea. On the afternoon of the 20th of October, Task Force Fury arrived at Gibraltar. The destroyers offloaded the cargo they had been carrying, and here, Furious and Somali will release them from the force and place into dry dock for repairs, where both ships will be out of action for a full month. With Furious out of the picture, command was transferred to Formidable, and the task force was renamed. Where it had been Task Force Fury under Furious, the group was renamed to Task Force Raider under Formidable. Operations having wrapped up for the time being in the south, Task Force Raider departed Gibraltar, heading for Liverpool. No sooner had they left Gibraltar than they ran into U-boats just off the coast. But much like every other U-boat encounter over the past week, I was running on fumes and just wanted the week to be over so I could go to bed. So the attackers were overhauled and ignored. On the night of the 23rd, the carrier group arrived in Liverpool with Resub 1 and Convoy Australia only a day steaming behind. Because Task Force Raider was down a destroyer, two of the Canadian vessels escorting Convoy Australia, HMS St. Laurent and Ottawa, were detached to go join the carrier group. However, nearly the moment they split off from the convoy, the bank sound indicated that it was the week of 15 and the start of week 16. While I was still awake though, I acquired a destroyer that was more akin to the tribal class she was replacing, the J-class destroyer HMS Javelin. After promptly passing the fuck out and waking up the following day to pick up week 16, after sending HMS Aberdeen back into the North Channel, Tarsal's raider was dispatched to the Channel, but before they could get there, Aberdeen stumbled across her newest prey after 2 weeks of abstinence. Then, later that night, she encountered the second U-boat. This too was destroyed. Idling south of Aberdeen, Tarsal's raider bumped into U-boats as well, one of them ending up right in front of Formidable. Cossack swung in to engage while Formidable turned away, the Tribal-class destroyer pulling some hard turns to make her pass. Anyhow, moving on from U-boats, Tarsal's raider was sitting in British waters waiting for the now merged Grease-Up 1 to arrive before moving in for the new tasking, suppressing and destroying the airfield at Brest. One moment, Aberdeen needs to make up for lost time. Having sunk 4 U-boats in a 24-hour period, Aberdeen returned to Liverpool to rearm, where I was surprised to find that the Luftwaffe wasn't sending out bomber squadrons for her. Anyway, back to Tarsal's radar. With Reese-Up 1 back on station, the carrier group was moving in to destroy the airfield at Brest, given that it had ballooned to a level 5 airfield. But, just short of the objective, the carrier group ran into U-boats just off the coast. The fleet's newest addition, Javelin, turned in to engage. There was, of course, one more U-boat, which 4 of the 5 destroyers were closing in on, but Javelin made contact first. She had expended all of her depth charges, 40-something in total, in one engagement, but Javelin had destroyed both targets. With the U-boat threat temporarily dealt with, Tarsal's raider closed the distance to Brest and bombarded it before heading back out. Almost immediately, though, she ran into more U-boats. Another pair, situated right in front of the fleet. While Javelin turned away, St. Laurent, Cossack and Maori closed in, with St. Laurent making the first pass. She disabled one of the U-boats but didn't sink it immediately, and had to delay a follow-up attack to deal with the second U-boat attempting to pass underneath her. Now out of position, St. Laurent backed up and let Cossack deal with the first disabled U-boat. The following morning, having rearmed from Resup 1, Task Force Raider was moving south when they were picked up by a float plane and then subsequently by bombers, 18 in total. In the resulting attack, Formidable was struck twice, but her 18 Fulmars acquitted themselves favourably by shooting down almost all of the bombers. But there were follow-up attacks to come. A second wave saw Formidable being struck twice more. While Task Force Raider was on the receiving end of the Luftwaffe's entire bomber force, I decided to go check out that surface force that had been going back and forth on the French coast for the past 3 months. Now, the last time I pointed this group out was in week 4, along the lines of... Apparently this is repeatable, because after resetting the game and having tried to enter vaguely the same area, the same bug occurred. A bug at the time meant that I couldn't enter tactical mode with this particular task force without the game crashing. However, that bug had been fixed by this point, meaning I could actually investigate it. And as it turned out, it was the battleship Skarnorst and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Apparently, instead of putting in for repairs, the 2 ships had just been sitting in the channel under air cover, whilst the battleship was half underwater as a result of being battered by swordfish. Task Force Raider was too far out of position to deal with the 2 capital ships for the time being, and in any case the ships were still under air attack. Oddly, this flight of Ju-88s was trying to target destroyers, but in any case all 4 were shot down by the fleet's Fulmars, as well as a single scout plane that had been keeping the carrier group spotted. North of the task force, Resup 1 had also been spotted and was attacked. Without any air defense of its own, the already damaged transport Zanland was lucky that the only bomb that hit her was a dud. Task Force Raider moved to protect the transports from further attack, but on the way they discovered the source of scout planes, a pair of German merchant raiders escorted by a small escort. A clusterfuck ensued. The raiders were attacked by the heavy cruisers, as well as by Formidable's 24 swordfish, while 3 attacking Ju-88s were shot down by the Fulmars. With the sheer number of swordfish I had access to, almost double of what Furious possessed, a pincer attack wasn't necessary. With all 24 aircraft approaching from one angle, both merchant raiders were utterly obliterated by more than a dozen cumulative torpedo hits. That did leave the escort, but to be perfectly honest, there was only ever going to be one way that type of engagement ended, with the tiny vessel being torn apart by a hail of gunfire. At nightfall, Task Force Raider made another run on Brest when they were bumped by... I'm sorry, how many U-boats? Having said at a collective 7 U-boats, the single biggest wolfpack I've seen to date in this game, both Task Force Raider and Resup 1 got out of dodge, Resup 1 heading north, while Task Force Raider made their bombardment run on Brest. The ships moved to link up with the transports, but they once again spawned right on top of U-boats, Cossack just about avoiding being hit at point blank range. After rearming, Task Force Raider was going to make another run in broad daylight, but seeing that the capital ship force was still idling in the channel, the carrier group was instead redirected to finish off the battleship and the heavy cruiser, the only 2 heavy surface assets that the Germans would have access to until February 1941 when Tirpitz came online. Sticking close to the British coast, Formidable launched her entire air group to attack once the 2 ships separated from their air cover. As per usual doctrine, the swordfish was split into elements and sent in for a pincer attack. The majority of the attackers will set up and wait for Prinz Eugen. The battleship, already crippled, wouldn't need too much persuasion to sink. Eventually, 2 flights swooped in for a bee's nest worth of AA fire, scoring 5 hits, more than what was needed to finish off the stricken battleship. With more than half of the swordfish package having been held in reserve, they were now let off the leash to attack Prinz Eugen in a pincer attack, and after a bit of micromanaging back and forth, the remainder attacked. Despite some sharp maneuvering, the heavy cruiser was struck by 5 torpedoes that crippled the ship. A second flight of 6 swordfish, which had butchered their approach and therefore still had their payloads, closed in and attacked again, striking with an extra 3 torpedoes. This overwhelmed the cruiser and she sank immediately after. 8 swordfish have been lost, but both targets were destroyed, and with them, the last capitalist ships in the Kriegsmarine, as well as any hopes of them being able to contest the open oceans. As it turned out though, the Luftwaffe was still perfectly capable of contesting the skies when a squadron of 9 Bf-109s ran into the task force radar while the Felmars were overhead. In the resulting fight, despite being outnumbered 2-1, the Bf-109 shot down 17 of the 18 Felmars, while only losing 4 of their own number in return. Having been bodied by fighters, Task Force Raider made a run-in on Brest before the group returned to Liverpool. But while on the way home, they ran into a pair of U-boats. After the destroyers dealt with this threat, the task force continued onwards, fighters elsewhere in the country dealing with the bombers that were now out looking for the group. After rearming at Liverpool, Task Force Raider headed back out for Brest. They hadn't even left British waters when they ran into U-boats again. However, with the destroyers failing to find any signs of the attackers, they pressed forwards. Now, because the South Channel was proving to be a hotspot for U-boat activity, a group similar to Aberdeen's North Channel Guard was formed. Creatively, this was called the South Channel Guard, but where Aberdeen was a one-ship crew, this force came to be made of 2 ships, the Flower-class corvettes Macleod and Camellia. Whilst the 2 corvettes had been acquired, they still had to get to their patrol location first, and that left Task Force Raider to face tank another U-boat encounter. Once again, none of the attackers were spotted, but given that there were a good 4 salvos of torpedoes in the water, it was most likely a larger wolf pack. Nevertheless, the task force continued to Brest, but they didn't get there before daybreak, and the first aircraft to bump the force were Bf-109s, for which the Felmars were withdrawn. Now going in without a fighter screen, the task force was now purely reliant on their own shipborne AA weapons. The level bombers all missed their payloads, and 2 of the 3 were shut down, but more problematic were the 12 Stukas approaching, the same kind of aircraft that had been the reason for Furious's damage, and the reason she was now in dry dock. Luckily, the majority of the Stukas had put their attention on the destroyers, and the only damage Formidable took was from a kamikaze that struck her right on the flight deck. Unluckily, this meant that Ottawa received unwelcome attention. She was struck twice. One of these bombs penetrated Ottawa's forward magazine and destroyed it, knocking out her forward 2 guns and causing considerable flooding, crippling the Canadian destroyer. She survived, but the consequent damage meant that she was only kept on station for her anti-submarine capabilities. Speaking of anti-submarine capabilities, the corvettes Macleod and Camellia had run into their first contact, a pair of U-boats. The excellent low to mid-speed handling characteristics of the Flower class meant that they had no problem getting on top of their targets, and having a second such ship also meant I could prosecute 2 attacks at once. The box pattern spread of their depth charges also made them extremely lethal against U-boats, a very good investment. Being so close to mainland Europe, the 2 ships were then attacked by bombers, and sadly the force was quick to collect some battle scars when Camellia was struck on the bow by a bomb, destroying a compartment. However, she was still seaworthy and mission capable, and thus carried on. Almost immediately following this attack, the two found a wolf pack and swooped in over them. Both ships had expended their depth charges and had to pull in to rearm, but having sunk 5 U-boats in the span of a day, they had most certainly earned their keep. If they could get to Liverpool without being harassed, that was. Fighters made gun runs on the corvettes, causing minor damage to the pair. Later on, the pair then ran into, of all the things, a pair of merchant raiders and their escort while in home waters. Being woefully unequipped to handle a surface engagement against anything, much less a pair of ships that had a 6-gun broadside each, Mallow and Camellia turned tail and ran like hell. With Tarsos raiders some 300 kilometers to the south, outside of launch range, the only support immediately on hand were from the nearby bases, and bombers were launched to intercept the merchant raiders and to protect the corvettes. That said, the bombers had to get there first before they could help, and as thus, the corvettes were dragged into another encounter from which they ran. Luckily, the merchant raiders backed off after this encounter, which gave some space for bombers from Plymouth and Liverpool to make an attack run. A single 1,000-pound bomb hit was scored by a Wellington, which crippled one of the raiders, knocking out its propeller shaft and rendering the ship dead in the water. With the threat at least reduced, the corvettes backed off as Tarsos' raider carried out another bombardment on Brest. On their way back to Liverpool, Tarsos' raider came across another wolf pack. This was one of the big ones, with a good 8 U-boats in its midst. Javelin just narrowly avoided being caught by the convergence of multiple salvos. Getting out of this encounter, the end of week 16 was heard. So, Furious is out and Formidable is in, and in the span of 2 weeks, the latter's already living up to the former's legacy, having sunk 2 capital ships, but U-boat activity was on a massive uptick, with 15 such vessels having been sunk in these 2 weeks. But with the formation of more dedicated anti-submarine groups, slowly but surely, the U-boat threat would be dealt with. This has been Battle of the Atlantic Mod for War on the Sea. Stay frosty, folks, and I'll catch you on the next one.